Are you tired of slow, low village wickets? Well, the hard work starts right now. I'm Rich from Mowd and I've seen cricket pitch care from both sides, and this is my guide to pre-season roll-in, which is the foundation of good cricket wickets. First of all, feed your grass. It's a very stressful time for your grass. It may not be growing vigorously yet due to the cold temperatures, and some of you won't have fed your square since the end of season renovations. So get some good nutrition into your square early. I prefer slow release spring fertiliser and a soil conditioner to alleviate some of the stress that I'm going to be creating by pressing the sward into the ground, and I also have a liquid fert on hand if the turf starts to look a little stressed and tired, just to give it a quick little boost. Next, we're looking at worm casts. If you treated for worms in the autumn, you should be okay, but you must have a cast free square before pre-season rolling. I use downcast really successfully. I haven't had any issues with worms since using it. I'll post a link down below where you can get that from. Start light and be patient, looking for a plasticine state on the soil, on the loam. If you push your thumb into the surface, you'll see an indentation, a bit of give but not too much. Start really light, and by light I mean walking behind a cylinder mower. Then you can move up to having a trailed seat behind that cylinder mower if you have one, then move on to an unballasted roller, and then finally add ballast until you are fully laden. If you're lucky, the weather and temperatures improve as you progress up the weights, and as the profile starts to dry out and becomes firmer, you can increase the weight. I avoid cutting my square too short, and I leave a bit of leaf on the grass to allow it to photosynthesize better and make as much energy as it can from the limited sunshine. There's still plenty of time to reduce the height of cut, and I find this alleviates a bit of the stress. It's multi-directional is the next option, and you should definitely work in like a union flag direction. You're going to be rolling in the direction of play all season long, so get plenty of cross and diagonal rolls in, and that will just make sure your surface is flat and true. And then marking out, controversially, I leave this till last because the ground can move a little bit, and if you're 1/8 of an inch out on each corner now, then that makes hell marking out later in the season. Don't forget, for sports pitch nutrition and fertiliser plans, go to sportsmode.uk.